a testimony to the thought-provoking, challenging ideas that we are going to discuss in relation to Gavin Hewitt's book, The Lost Continent. But first of all, I've got to say a big thank you and indeed well done to the sponsors of this event, Baillie Gifford. They are one of the UK's largest independent investment trust managers based in Edinburgh. I think they have been particularly fine sponsors this year because they've actually worked with Ways with Words to help bring a variety of thought-provoking financial and economic themed events to the programme this year, and this event is one of them. If you want to find any more about them, the copy of their magazine at Trust is outside, and I think also there's leaflets on your chairs. There's an opportunity to win a weekend at the Words by the Water Festival, which is absolutely wonderful in Keswick. Okay, now, Gavin Hewitt, I think, is known to very many of us. BBC's Europe editor since 2009, and absolutely uniquely placed, therefore, to write the story of these extraordinary times. Previously, he was special correspondent for the BBC 10 o'clock news and for Panorama. He's an award-winning journalist who's covered stories all over the world, and an author of 2 previous books, including one on Terry Waite. His book, The Lost Continent, I think is receiving wide acclaim because he tackles probably one of the biggest political dramas in Europe for 60 years, but does it in a way in which actually real voices, real personalities kind of come through. So, over to you, Gavin.
It's a great pleasure to be in Dartington, and thank you all on this most beautiful summer day coming into a place like this to listen of all subjects to something about Europe. So thank you very much. Some years ago, the city of Naples in Italy, Napoli, won the UEFA Cup. It was unexpected, and there was a carnival of celebration. And someone, in typical Neapolitan fashion, headed down to the largest cemetery and scrawled on the wall, "You missed a great game." A short while later, a fresh piece of graffiti appeared. "Who said we missed it?" I was reminded of this when, at a recent austerity protest in Naples, a young man appeared with a t-shirt that declared, "I don't want to die of uncertainty." Initially, I thought it was just another piece of Neapolitan humour. Yet on reflection, it seemed to sum up some of the agony of a lost generation, uncertain of the future, uncertain of where jobs will come from, and also a Europe uncertain of the consequences of its deepest dreams. Now, each week, stories, ideas, rumours, gossip fall into my inbox. And some of them, just 2 or 3 of them, give an insight into this profound crisis that is changing Europe. Recently, the Prado Museum in Madrid, which many of you have been to, advertised for 11 posts. And part of that job would have been overseeing, looking after the El Grecos, the Velasquez, and the Picassos. Not a bad job, you might think, but it was only going to pay €13,000 a year. The museum was swamped. It received over 18,300 applications. An insight into a market where over 60% of young people can't find work. And just another random example of the winds of change blowing through Europe. I had an occasion not so long ago to go on holiday to the Greek island of Ithaca. It was where, after the Trojan War, Odysseus ended his journey. Now, the islands nearby are remote and largely unspoilt. In the modern era, Churchill, John Kennedy, Maria Callas, and yes, Roman Abramovich have all dropped anchor there. But in these troubled times, something of a fire sale is going on. A certain emir has also cast his anchor. He's bought one island for €5 million and is negotiating over another 5. A Russian businessman, I understand, may well be angling to buy scorpions. Greece is in the 6th year of seeing its economy contract and is having to sell off the silver. And in Greek terms, that means some of its islands. And even the Elysee Palace, because France has been so resistant to budget cuts, has had to make the gesture of doing something. And what I heard that they were trying to do in the Elysee Palace was auctioning off bottles of wine. It turns out the home of the French presidency is said to have the best wine cellar in France, 15,000 bottles of wine. And incidentally, we learned that General de Gaulle liked champagne, Mitterrand liked a Médoc, Chirac, he liked a Corona beer. And Nicolas Sarkozy, well, he didn't drink. I mention these rather random examples because, in a way, it is what my story is about. Europe in crisis because of the Eurozone, and as I've said, in the midst of profound and unexpected change. Now, one neighbourhood, it is our neighbourhood where we visit and go on vacations, and so we know these countries and we've had experiences there. Now, before I really begin, I wanted to drop in some stats, and they will become perhaps more relevant later. In Europe today, and many of you will know this, it is the young who are bearing the brunt of the crisis. Unemployment for those under 25 in France is 26%, it's 38% in Portugal, 40% in Italy, 55% in Spain, and over 60% in Greece. In the modern era, these figures are unprecedented. It led the Prime Minister of Greece to tell Bill Clinton, who was visiting, that parts of Europe were enduring a Great Depression. Chancellor Merkel of Germany has spoken of Europe's toughest hour since World War II. And the former governor of the Bank of England described it as the most serious crisis we have had since the 30s. And alongside the end of communism, this has been the biggest political drama in Europe for 60 years. And it's the story of a dream that turned dangerous, and what I've tried to capture in my book. Now, I want to begin with some anecdotes, funny in a way, but revealing of how this crisis started. In 2003, the people of a small village in the Spanish province of Castellón were told an airport was to be built nearby. They were bewildered and a little unconvinced because there was another airport not far away in Valencia. And they were also a little concerned because every takeoff and landing would rattle their windows. Now, with the backing of a man called Carlos Fabra, a powerful local politician, the project was pushed through at a cost of €155 million. Sparkling new roads were built connecting to the airport. A further $7 million was spent on advertising. The only problem, the airlines were just not interested. In any event, the winds were in the wrong direction, and there was not even a test flight. Now, Fabra was undeterred. A statue was built at the entrance to the airport called the Plane Man, presumably a statue of Fabra himself. That cost another $300,000. And later a local paper ran a mocking headline, "Newsflash, plane is seen at Castellón Airport." It turned out to be the arrival of an aluminium model plonked on top of the statue. Now, when challenged about this white elephant, Fabra provoked ridicule when he tried to argue this was not an airport for planes, but for people, so that they could wander around and enjoy the runway. But Castellón Airport was not alone. In Spain, there were ghost airports, ghost towns, a ghost port, even a ghost prison, where not a prisoner has shown up. Because Spain had been caught up in the delirium of a building boom. In 2006, Spain consumed more concrete than France, Belgium, Germany and Italy combined. And Spain was not alone in its delirium. In Ireland, the Celtic tiger certainly roared, but it too was largely built on a real estate bubble. In just 10 years, property prices quadrupled and Ireland gorged itself. 550,000 houses were built. 300,000 were never occupied. And here, too, for a period, the good times rolled. Per head of population, Ireland had more Mercedes than Germany. And Ireland, too, had its ghost estates. You know, it rezoned so much land for housing that it would have had to have doubled its population to fill the houses that were planned. And Greece, let's not forget Greece, it too revelled in the easy money. Suddenly this Aegean nation was boasting more Porsche Cayennes than anywhere else in Europe. And perhaps a clue as to what was to come lay with the philosophy of Aristotle Onassis, who for a time was Greece's most famous businessman and one-time husband of Jackie Kennedy. To be successful, he said, look tanned, live in an elegant building, even if you're in the cellar, be seen in smart restaurants, even if you nurse one drink, and if you borrow, borrow big. And that's precisely what Greece did. So, what lay behind this delirium? And I'm now going to give just a little bit of history before we move forward. When those countries joined the euro and became part of a monetary union, there was one interest rate for all. Low interest rates, which suited Germany, stoked spending booms elsewhere. And German and French banks were only too willing to pump funds into these fast-charging economies. In 2005, with the Irish property boom at its peak, interest rates were at 2%. They needed to be at least 6% to rein in the boom. And it was in 2008 that the good times really ended. Lehman Brothers in the States collapsed, and credit dried up, and the great unmasking began. As the legendary American investor Warren Buffett once observed, it is only when the tide goes out do you discover who has been swimming naked. And it took a year for Europe to be exposed, and the first naked swimmer to show up was Greece in October 2009. There had been an election. In the days that followed, it was discovered that their deficit was twice what had been acknowledged. Greek accounts were as good as fakes. Europe was stunned. It simply had no plan, no structure to deal with a country that might not be able to finance itself. And so began what became known as the Eurozone crisis, which has shaken Europe to its core. Now, for long periods in the past 3 years, Europe has been very afraid, and not just for the Eurozone, but for the entire European project. And that has been the story of the last 3 years. Now, some more history. The euro was launched only partly for economic reasons. It was principally a political project, a building block to ever closer union. Up until that point, the European project had had a string of successes. It helped make conflict between the European great powers, particularly France and Germany, impossible. It helped build a united front against communism. It served as a beacon for democracy for parts of Central and Eastern Europe. It created a single market, which we all benefit from today, and expanded the free movement of people. Many of Europe's leaders saw the single currency as the next giant step towards integrating Europe. And this dream was given momentum by the fall of the Berlin Wall. As the wall came down, it was soon apparent that the old fear of a united and powerful Germany had not completely disappeared. It lurked there in the minds of leaders like Margaret Thatcher. Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor at the time, recalls Margaret Thatcher saying, "We beat the Germans twice, and now they're back." And interestingly enough, Margaret Thatcher had an ally in François Mitterrand, the French president. At a lunch together in the Élysée Palace, he warned reunification would result in Germany gaining more influence in Europe than Hitler ever had. He believed Germany needed to be bound more tightly into Europe through deeper European integration. I believe, he said, it is the EU, and only the EU, that can contain this German power. And the German Chancellor understood a price would have to be paid for German reunification. And that price was a shared currency and that meant replacing the beloved Deutschmark. The French and others saw a single currency as a way of binding a reunited Germany into Europe and its institutions. Now, countries intending to join the euro had to meet certain criteria. They had to reduce their debts and their deficits. Now, in many instances, the figures were fudged. The German Chancellor at the time, as I said, was a man named Helmut Kohl, and he was warned, for instance, about Italy's finances. But he said he felt the weight of history. You couldn't go ahead, he said, without the Italians. As for the Greeks, the view was you couldn't say no to the country of Plato. So officials and leaders were caught up in the romance of the project, and rules were bent and broken. And plenty of economists doubted it would work. It was not just that many of the economists were so different. It was questioned how you could have monetary union without controlling budgets and spending, fiscal union, and to do that you probably needed political union. But the early years silenced the critics. Europe was booming, and very rapidly the euro became the world's reserve currency. As I said, all of that really came to a head in 2008 with the collapse in the financial world in the United States, and by the following year, Greece was in difficulty. Now, in early 2010, the prevailing view was that Greece just needed to slash its spending and get its house in order. The German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, did not like rule breakers or the profligate. She had praised the thriftiness of the Swabian housewife. But as 2010 developed, it was apparent that Greece could not manage its debts, and the EU was left with a huge dilemma. One of the conditions that had persuaded the Germans to give up their, as I say, their beloved Deutschmark was an undertaking that countries would not be responsible for the debts of others. That meant no bailout. But under pressure from other European leaders and the Americans, she was persuaded to abandon that key commitment. And during this period, events were being driven not by the politicians, but by the bond markets. It reminded me of what President Clinton's advisor, James Carville, once wrote. He said, "I need to think, if there was reincarnation, I wanted to come back as the president or the pope, but now I want to come back as the bond market, because that way I can intimidate everybody." And during that period, and I'm talking about 2010, the power lay to change Europe and its plans, and that came mainly from the bond market. Now, the Americans and others were saying that if Greece defaulted, it would undermine the European banking system and drag down other European countries and threaten the global economy. So Greece was given a massive bailout, and the EU agreed to set up a 750 billion euro rescue fund. Now, the Prime Minister of Greece at the time was a man by the name of George Papandreou, and he warned his country of very tough times ahead. For in exchange for being rescued, there would have to be severe spending cuts. He says, and this is what he told me, that Angela Merkel said to him that Greece was in effect being punished to dissuade other countries from ever seeking a bailout. But you know, the Greeks weren't grateful. They took to the streets, buildings were burnt, and some people died. And it led to a war of words between these two countries. The Germans were offended by this Greek reaction. In their eyes, they had loaned Greece large sums of money, and in exchange, they expected the Greek people to embrace reforms. And they were also appalled by the stories they heard coming out of Greece, and they gave them huge prominence in their papers. Now, it turned out at that time in Greece, you could retire at the age of 50 if you did a hazardous job. Well, it turned out there were quite a few of these hazardous jobs. More than 500 of them, to be precise. Hairstylists were judged to be a dangerous position. All that handling of hair dye. Trombonists too. All that puffing. And even journalists could head for early retirement on those Greek islands because the microphones were judged to contain dangerous bacteria. So I'll be leaving shortly. Now, the German people